And good afternoon. This is the Tuesday installment of Rhythms of Grace. I'm Chad Bresson, and welcome, Nature Coast. Hope you're having a grace-filled day today. Hope your day's halfway through and you've already experienced the grace of Jesus. Maybe some of you are having bad days and you're trying to figure out how to get through it. Well, hopefully we will spend some time here it's already afternoon. I want to say this afternoon, thinking about some of the things and some of the ways that Jesus graces us. And we're going to be using Psalm 2 to do that this morning, or this afternoon again. Last week we looked at Psalm 1. Psalm 1 is a summary of the rest of the Psalter. Whoever put the collection of psalms together, and I tend to think it was somebody in Solomon's court, probably started in David's era, but certainly by the time Solomon comes on the scene, Solomon is a collector. He collects the Proverbs together. He probably has somebody doing that for the songbook for Israel as well. But last week, Psalm 1, kind of a summary, introduction. The blessed man kind of kicks off the Psalms, and then that theme follows all the way through the Psalms. The second Psalm, some think, belongs with the first Psalm, as if the two are connected. It's different a little bit thematically, but it also serves a purpose. If Psalm 1 is the summary, then Psalm 2 kind of provides the historical context, or the context for the Psalter, in that Psalm 2 is a psalm for the king. Psalm 1 is a psalm for the king and his people. Psalm 2 as well, but is most specifically addressing the divine rights of the king, and was probably used as a coronation liturgy for not only David, but anybody who followed him. And that's kind of an interesting thought too. Imagine, as we read Psalm 2, imagine King Ahab, who was not exactly the greatest of Israel's kings, certainly the most notorious. Imagine this psalm being sung or stated at his inauguration or coronation. So let's read Psalm 2, and then we'll have a couple of thoughts for our day, and hopefully highlight grace here in this particular psalm, because again, all of these psalms have something to do with Jesus and what he's doing for us, and that's certainly true of Psalm 2. We'll see that in just a second. Let's read it together, and I'm reading today from the ESV again. I tend to think that the ESV captures this particular psalm a little better than the CSB. So, Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, and they are saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, and the Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Well, that's Psalm 2. And it's easy to see why this was probably a coronation song, sung at the coronation of Israel's kings, having something to do with the Lord's anointed one. Right off the bat, we are told this. But some things for us to just briefly think about. Again, we're not going to jump into all the different things that we could think about from this particular psalm, but some things to think about in this psalm. One of the things that when I think about this psalm is that there's a lot of noise here. Unlike the first psalm, in which you have kind of this idyllic imagery of a tree being planted by streams of water and that kind of garden-like feel to Psalm 1. Here, there is just a lot of noise, and in particular, a lot of anger here. Why do the nations rage is the very first sentence or the first question being asked by the king and his people as they sing this song. Why do the nations rage and the people plot in vain? And then the response that comes is God in his wrath responding to these kings or these rulers. He who sits in the heavens laughs. We have some emotion there. The whole Lord holds them in derision. So there is his response, but then it also says he will speak to them in his wrath. And at the very end, these people are encouraged to kiss the Son lest he be angry like his Father. So a lot of anger, a lot of noise, a lot of rage. We're hit with that right off the bat. So we are met with, as we come to this psalm, a lot of anger. And we're supposed to feel that noise. And in their anger, the kings of the earth, the rulers of the earth are saying, let us burst their bonds apart. There's some contrast being painted here. First of all, you have the kings and the rulers saying what they are saying, and then you have God almost emphatically saying something against them. So there's a contrast between the kings and the rulers, and then God responding to those kings and rulers, and then the anointed one set up over against all these others. So you have this contrast between kings and rulers of the world and this anointed one. You also have a contrast on what is being said. Let us burst our cords, our bonds, whatever enshackles us, and tear them asunder. And again, this is being spoken against the anointed one. But the anointed one is being told by his Father, you are going to be the one who breaks them with a rod of iron. So they're wanting to break chains, and then the anointed one is being told, you're going to break them. So a bunch of contrast being painted here. And what are we to make of all this? One of the things as we come to this psalm actually as it's presented to us in our pop evangelicalism is, when it's all said and done, this psalm is the psalm of the kings and the anointed one who is going to get his day against these kings of the earth and the peoples who are plotting in vain. It's almost like it's presented as a comeuppance psalm in which the anointed one finally has his day, gets his say, and is eventually going to smash his enemies. And that's the way the psalm is typically presented, as here is King Jesus, here is the anointed one of Israel, David. And it's interesting, in Acts this is called a psalm of David. David saying, and then any of the Israel kings who are there by divine right, saying against they're being told by God over against the enemies, you're going to smash them. You have been chosen, you have been anointed, you have been placed in this position to smash your enemies. And that is a way to look at this. Ultimately, this is about Jesus, and no psalm is quoted more in the New Testament than this one. In fact, very few passages in the Old Testament are quoted more than this one, because of some of the themes here. But one of the things I want to say is, I'm not sure that's where we need to, or where we should go immediately. In fact, the New Testament authors don't do that with this particular psalm. And it's interesting, when the New Testament comes to quoting this psalm, the first place the New Testament goes, in fact, the New Testament really seems to camp on this. The New Testament authors, including the gospel writers, camp on the middle part of this particular psalm, where the Lord said to me, and again, this is the anointed one speaking, the Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. That, of course, is quoted by the Father in Christ's baptism. You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And then the apostles pick up on this in Acts 4. And again, they're quoting this particular psalm because they have met, they know the Son. Hebrews also pulls this in. Revelation does too. In fact, Revelation is the only place in which the kind of royal divine warrior figure is emphasized for the purposes of John and his audience in the book of Revelation. But elsewhere, there's a little bit of a twist, and this twist in the New Testament forces us to go back to Psalm 2 and see something else that is going on here. In the New Testament, a big deal is made of the fact that this anointed one is called a son. And of course, David is called the son here initially, and so that's how we first read it. But we, of course, know from David's story, he ultimately is not the anointed one who has come to save all, or the rest of Israel's kings for that matter. But the son is presented in the New Testament in his humanity. And he is going to ascend Mount Zion. He is going to ascend his throne. He is going to smash his enemies in a little different way than we are typically presented with in this passage. It's not simply him taking his throne and taking his scepter and saying, yes, I am the anointed one and I am going to crush my enemies because that's what the Father has promised me. Instead, Christ smashes his enemies. And when we think about enemies here too, that's the other thing we need to keep in mind. We're not simply talking about a political system. We are not talking simply about politics and kings and rulers and political entities of this world. Because even as the New Testament interprets this, anything that sets itself over against the anointed one is being pulled in here. You know, it's why do the nations rage? Why do the people plot in vain? And Acts pulls that into this psalm. They are reading in this psalm everybody. Anything that sets itself over against the anointed one. So any ideology, any philosophy, any thought, any idea that sets itself over the anointed one is in the purview here. And the Father, in his wrath, that as for me, that as for me here in verse 2 is almost a thunderous quelling of the tumult of those who would set themselves over against the anointed one. And by the way, there are hints probably of Joshua 24 here. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The same. It's interesting. You go back and read Joshua 24. A lot of the same themes here, same context here, when it comes to all of the nations and all of the other rulers and all of the other kingdoms of the world set over against this one. And that's here. As for me, God thunders, and in his thundering says, I have set my anointed one over all things. And in calling him a son then sets up for us to see some other things going on, including the fact that this is Jesus. And then as the New Testament again interprets this, Jesus doing something different with this. He is quelling, he is smashing his enemies by going to the cross. And that's certainly part of what's coming up in his baptism. The idea that he is going to die, that his victory over his enemies, that his silencing of his enemies, that this ultimate victory, even what gives him the right to be the rider on the white horse in Revelation is the fact that he is going to die. The other thing that we should see here about this particular son, this particular anointed one, in turning this all upside down, so to speak, is in going to the cross, he is not going in a roar. He's going not speaking at all. He dies not saying a word, so to speak. Now we have the 7 sayings of the cross. I know all that. And he does say some things, but the image that we're presented in the New Testament of this anointed one who goes to die is as a lamb before his shears is dumb. He didn't open his mouth. He is not going up against his enemies in a rage, but in fact is going quite willingly to the cross, dying for all of this. And as the apostles in Acts 4 pick up on this, part of his establishing himself as the anointed one over against his enemies then is righting all the wrongs. And that includes the healing and the signs and the proclamation of the gospel, all those things that went with Christ's humiliation, that is then true for the Acts 4 church. They see this as being part of this psalm. In other words, Christ is there. This is my son. Today I have begotten you, is a son who dies for his people. And then gives them all those things that they don't deserve, that are part of his divine right. Now he just lavishes on his people. That is the kind of divine warrior that we are to see here in Psalm 2. Not somebody who is saber-rattling over against all those who would establish themselves against the Anointed One. No, someone who comes and dies for them. And why do we say that? Because in Acts 4, that's just a fascinating passage. I'm not going to read it right now, but when they quote this passage in Acts 4, they pull in everybody, and they basically say it wasn't simply the Romans who were up against Jesus. It wasn't simply the Jewish leaders who crucified Jesus. No, they pull in the Romans, they pull in the Jewish leaders, they pull in all the Gentiles, all nations, and then they pull in all of Israel. And by the time they're done with their list of those who have set themselves over against the Anointed One, we should see that that includes us. That includes us. We are those who have raged. We are those who plot in vain over against the Anointed One. We are those who have participated in those worldviews that set themselves up against the Anointed One. We are those for whom that son then dies. And the grace in all of this is found at the very end of Psalm 2. It's a little, almost like a bit line that's added to the end, so much so that if you were to pick up a commentary and read Psalm 2, there are some guys who think, this doesn't even belong in this particular psalm. Well, it does. It's interesting, David, as he's putting all of this together, even as he understands himself to be among those, interestingly enough, who have plotted against the Anointed One. Even as he's thinking of all this, he says, "Blessed are those who take refuge in this Anointed One." Doesn't belong here, but it does. And that's the grace. That's the grace in of all this. And it's interesting that he uses that particular language, again, forcing us not simply to come to this psalm and then just present Jesus as somebody who is not simply saber-rattling, but eventually going to smash all of God's enemies, which he, again, did at the cross. But he presents Christ as one in whom there is to be refuge. This grand warrior, this one who has been set on God's throne, the one who has been set on Zion, which is again is a figure for temple. He's been set over all these things, whether it's temple, whether it's kingdom, whatever. Christ has been set, and he is set there as God's son, and he does this for us. And then he offers himself to us, and we are to take refuge in him. So the Christ, for those of us who have been blessed, is not someone to be feared in that sense. This is more like the Matthew 11 Jesus, the one who offers rest, the one who offers refuge. Come to me, all you who are heavy laden. I will give you, in this psalm, refuge. I will give you rest. So, all that to say, this entire psalm does present the Anointed One as one who has been given all things. He has been given all the kingdoms and all the kings and rulers and everybody in the earth. He has been given control of all of this. That's the guy to whom we go for rest and refuge. he presents himself as somebody to be confided in, to find rest in, because he died for us. Because of all the things that he did in order to make Psalm 2 actually happen. And that's the grace for us in Rhythms of Grace. We didn't deserve any of this. We don't deserve that little piece, that little line at the bottom. Blessed are those who find rest. We don't deserve that. Because we're among those who are plotting in vain. We're those raging against the Anointed One. If left to ourselves, instead he intervenes. And he chooses us. He calls us his own. He saves us. And he blesses us. He invites us to take refuge and rest in him. So whatever is happening in your life today, it might feel like it's out of control. I don't know what's happened earlier on this Tuesday. You might think this Tuesday is far gone, and it might be, humanly speaking. I wish I could help you with that, but Jesus is here. Just look at that last line. And the one who is saying that, blessed is the one who takes refuge in him, is the one who is sitting on Mount Zion, providing his presence to you. And so take confidence in that. Know you are graced. Know you are blessed. Find your rest in Jesus, even in this tumultuous world, even in a busy day, even when this day is just filled with noise that seems to overwhelm you, me. Blessed are those who find their refuge in Jesus. That's today's Rhythm of Grace. I hope it has been helpful. I hope this psalm is helpful to you. A lot of great things in these first two psalms. And again, they set the rest of the tone for the rest of the Psalter. All of the psalms are messianic. They are all in some way pointing to something that Jesus has done or is doing for his people, because we can't. He's doing it for us. And then he graces us with whatever blessings those psalms are talking about. And that includes Psalm 2. He's our refuge. Join us again sometime tomorrow or some other times during this week, right back here on the Nature Coast page for more Rhythms of Grace. And I hope that your rest of the Tuesday is filled with a lot of grace. And I know it will be, because that's what Jesus has promised. He has promised to give you grace. And so if you just take some time in the tumult to look for it and remind yourself, he loves you. You've been graced. Hope you have a good rest of the Tuesday.